Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving straight into a totally mind-bending piece of alternate history today from the text Crown and Colony. We're going to visualize exactly how just one single changed event back in the late 18th century would have completely rewritten the modern world that you and I are living in right now. So let's kick this off by asking the ultimate what-if question. Imagine a world where George Washington's Continental Army was decisively crushed at Long Island or, entirely captured and defeated during that freezing winter at Valley Forge. The stakes of those battles were literally astronomical. If the rebellion had been broken right then and there, the global geopolitical landscape wouldn't have just shifted a little bit. It would be completely rewritten from the ground up. The United States of America? Never born. Instead, the entirety of North America would have remained this massive, heavily fortified collection of British Crown colonies, locked permanently into the empire. Section 1. The Rebellion Crushed. In the immediate aftermath of a British victory, the political retribution against the colonies would be, swift and absolutely brutal. I mean, think about that for a second. We would never have seen the birth of the United States. Men like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington, they wouldn't be revered as founding fathers in our history books, no way. They would have been put on trial by the Crown for high treason and executed. And this would likely happen in highly publicized spectacles, specifically meant to send a chilling message to any other colony even thinking about rebellion. The whole narrative of freedom and democracy would have been severely suppressed, completely rewritten by the victors as a cautionary tale of treasonous betrayal. And this systematic dismantling of colonial independence would follow a really ruthless, step-by-step logic. To completely wipe out the risk of future uprisings, the Crown would go way past just executing the leadership. They'd permanently dissolve the local colonial assemblies, basically stripping away any illusion of self-governance. In their place, a severe military government overseen by royal governors gets installed. From there, the harsh economic realities of the 1700s would kick in. The British Empire was deeply in debt from years of global warfare, and they would aggressively tax those 13 colonies to pay it all off. The core philosophy of mercantilism would be strictly enforced, stripping the local American economy of its autonomy entirely, making sure these colonies existed for one purpose and one purpose only, to feed raw materials into the vast, growing industrial hunger of London. Section 2. Redrawing North America. Let's zoom out to the continental level for a second, because a British victory completely changes the story of how the North American continent was actually settled. The crucial anchor point here is the British Proclamation of 1763. Now, historically, this was a primary trigger of the American Revolution, mostly because ambitious colonists desperately wanted to expand westward and claim new land. But the British Empire was nearly bankrupt from the 7 Years' War, so they simply couldn't afford the incredibly costly border wars that westward expansion would provoke with indigenous nations. So, in this alternate timeline, with a victorious and totally unopposed British military, this boundary line along the Appalachian Mountains would have been fiercely enforced by heavily armed redcoat garrisons. They'd strictly confine the colonists to the eastern seaboard. When we compare the differing outcomes here, the contrast it's absolutely staggering. The rapid American homesteading we know from history and the tragic systematic forced displacement of native nations that came with it would have been completely curtailed. Instead, the vast interior of North America, places like the Ohio River Valley and the Great Plains, would have evolved into an interconnected network of British-protected indigenous protectorates. The Crown would have treated these native confederacies as sovereign buffer states to block other European powers like Spain or France. It's like a giant geopolitical puzzle. This gives us a completely different demographic, cultural, and political map of the continent, preserving millions of acres of indigenous land. Section 3. The Early Abolition. A British victory also fundamentally rewrites one of the most deeply painful chapters of human history. Just take a look at this timeline. In our reality, the preservation of slavery was heavily protected for decades by entrenched Southern political power within the newly formed U.S. federal government. But without the United States breaking away, the timeline shifts dramatically. Driven by its own internal abolitionist movements, the British Empire passed the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833. Without an independent, sovereign American South capable of passing its own laws to protect the institution, the British Empire would have enforced emancipation across the North American colonies 3 full decades earlier than it happened in our reality. Now, wealthy Southern plantation owners would have undoubtedly mounted intense economic resistance, and they likely would have attempted localized rebellions to protect their wealth. However, they wouldn't have had the political shield of a sympathetic federal government, nor the logistical capacity to fight a protracted war. The overwhelming military might of the British forces. Specifically, we're talking the unrivaled dominance of the Royal Navy blockading ports like Charleston, combined with regular army garrisons, would have crushed that planter resistance locally. This alternate timeline ends slavery across the continent without the catastrophic, widespread bloodshed of the American Civil War, which, as we know, cost over 600,000 lives in the 1860s. Section 4. A world without world wars. Zooming out even further to the global scale, the geopolitical rivalries of the 20th century would look completely unrecognizable. By the dawn of the 1900s, we'd be looking at an unassailable global hyperpower. Imagine an empire holding both the vast, untapped natural resources of the North American continent and the immense wealth of India simultaneously. This entity would possess total, unchallenged control over global trade routes, naval choke points, and industrial manufacturing. Because of this monumental concentration of power, imagine a figure like Kaiser Wilhelm or later European dictators looking across the ocean. They would definitely think twice before ever challenging a British empire backed by the infinite industrial output of Pennsylvania steel and the combined manpower of North America and the British Isles. The sheer deterrence factor fundamentally prevents the conditions that led to the World Wars. When you stack these two realities side by side, the paradigm shift is pretty staggering. We go from a North American continent divided into the USA and Canada to one unified, massive British dominion stretching all the way from the Arctic down to the Gulf of Mexico. We trade our current Americanized English dominance for traditional British English hegemony worldwide. We see the horrific institution of slavery dismantled in 1833 rather than 1865. And geopolitically, the world shifts from a chaotic, multipolar dynamic with competing, warring powers into an absolute unipolar British hegemony. We're talking a permanent Pax Britannica, where global conflicts are suppressed by a single dominant police force. Section 5. The alternate 2026. So what does all this mean for us today, right now, in the modern world? Well, if we were living in this alternate 2026, our daily lives would feel profoundly alien. Our modern world would not be shaped by American pop culture, so you'd probably be watching cricket instead of baseball. There'd be no US dollar supremacy dictating global markets and inflation. There'd be no Silicon Valley driving an independent tech boom. Instead, our entire planet's technology and commerce would be wired through highly centralized, London-centric financial networks. And honestly, you'd likely be watching this explainer while drinking a mandatory afternoon tea instead of a massive iced coffee. The whole globe would be governed under the overarching umbrella of a global constitutional monarchy, seamlessly unified under the Union Jack. Our source material sums up this sweeping analysis with a really powerful conclusion, stating that this exercise in alternate history is, quote, proving that the shot fired at Lexington and Concord truly was the moment that decided the fate of the modern world. It's a brilliant reminder that history is definitely not inevitable. It highlights just how unbelievably fragile modern geopolitics really are, showing us that everything we know about our current global order rests entirely on the outcome of a few muddy late 18th century battles. I'll leave you with this final thought to ponder as we wrap up today's explainer. When you look at the massive global ripple effects of this alternate timeline, just how much of our reality, our culture, and our map was decided by one single musket flash?